There is a room in Sunnyvale, California, that most people will never see. It sits inside a low building the color of dry earth, and along one wall runs a display case, and behind that glass, propped up like a religious relic, is a purple felt banner and a stuffed toy character with two enormous eyes and a wide, dumb, joyful grin. It is a plush version of a mascot, the kind of thing a company hands out at a trade show, the kind of thing that ends up in a landfill within a year. But this one survived, and if you stood in front of it long enough, you might not believe that this small, silly artifact once belonged to a company worth more than $125 billion. A company that, at the turn of the millennium, was the front door to the entire internet. A company that, on two separate occasions, could have bought a small search engine called Google, once for $1 million, once for $3 billion. And both times, looked at the numbers, looked at the future, and said no. That company was Yahoo, and this is the story of how it built the world's most valuable window onto the web, how it stood at the exact center of the exploding internet with more traffic than any site on Earth, and how it managed to say no to the one deal that would have made it immortal, not once, but twice, because that is the thing that keeps people up at night when they think about Yahoo. It wasn't destroyed by a single mistake. It was a company of brilliant, hard-working engineers who kept arriving at the right doorway, standing in it, and then walking away. This is the channel where we take the companies that built the electronic world and trace them down to the circuit board, the part numbers, the clock speeds, the server racks, the exact dates, and above all the engineers whose names almost never make it into the story. So before we go any further, if you love the machines and the people who built them, subscribe, because this archive is still being built, and there are 100 companies like this one waiting in the glass case. To understand why Yahoo said no, you have to go back to a trailer parked on the Stanford University campus in the winter of 1994. Not a building, a trailer, a temporary structure with thin walls, a space heater that never quite worked, and a wall of workstations that ran hot enough to make the whole room smell faintly of warm plastic and old carpet. Inside were two graduate students in electrical engineering, both stalled on their doctoral dissertations, both procrastinating in the most productive way imaginable. The first was David Filo, a soft-spoken engineer from Wisconsin by way of Louisiana, a man who was famous even then for sleeping under his desk on a sleeping bag and for a wardrobe that never seemed to change. The second was Jerry Yang, born in Taipei, who had arrived in the United States at the age of 10, knowing exactly one word of English, the word shoe, and who had gone on to master the language so completely that within a few years he was tearing through Stanford's engineering program. The two of them were supposed to be working on a doctoral project involving computer-aided design of circuits. Instead, they had discovered something far more interesting: the World Wide Web. In 1994, the web was tiny and chaotic and thrilling. There was no map of it, there was no index. There were pages appearing every day at universities and research labs and the occasional strange hobbyist's home computer, and there was no reliable way to find any of them. If you heard that a good page existed somewhere, you had to know its exact address, or you had to stumble onto a link from another page and hope it hadn't gone dead. The web was a library where someone had dumped all the books on the floor in the dark, so Filo and Yang did what engineers do when confronted with chaos. They started to catalog it. They began keeping a list. Just a list, a hand-built collection of links to the websites they thought were good, organized into categories. Sports here, science there, business over here. They ran it on a sun workstation in the trailer. One Yang had nicknamed Akabono, after a famous sumo wrestler, and Filo ran the software on a machine called Konishiki, another sumo name, because the two of them had a running joke about the enormous weight these machines were carrying. They called the whole project at first Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web. It was exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. But here is the thing that separated their list from the dozens of other link collections floating around the early web. They curated it by hand. Every single site was visited, evaluated, and filed by a human being, by them. And crucially, they nested the categories inside each other. You didn't just get a flat list of 2,000 links. You got recreation, and inside recreation, you got sports. And inside sports, you got baseball. And inside baseball, you got the teams. It was a hierarchy. It was a tree. And for a brief golden window in the history of the internet, a hand-built tree of the entire web was not only possible, it was the single most useful thing you could give a person who had just discovered they could connect to the whole world through a phone line. The traffic came fast, and it did not stop. Word spread from student to student, from lab to lab, and the little sun workstation in the Stanford trailer began to strain under the load. By the fall of 1994, the guide was serving so many requests that it was starting to clog Stanford's network. A graduate side project was interfering with the university's actual research. Something had to give. Late in 1994, they renamed it. The story they told for years was that Yahoo stood for yet another hierarchical, officious oracle, a backronym, an engineer's joke, the kind of self-deprecating recursive acronym that MIT and Stanford students loved. But the two of them admitted more than once that they had really chosen the word because they liked the definition in the dictionary. A Yahoo was a rude, unsophisticated, uncouth person, the kind of primitive brute Jonathan Swift had invented in Gulliver's Travels. They liked that. They thought of themselves and their scrappy hand-built list as Yahoos. And so, on a Sun workstation in a hot trailer with 2 graduate dissertations quietly dying on the hard drives beside it, the most visited website of the coming decade received its name. What neither of them fully understood yet, what almost nobody understood in the winter of 1994, was that the very thing making them successful, the human hand curating every single link, was also a clock quietly counting down. A human hand can visit and file 1,000 sites, maybe 10,000 if you never sleep, maybe 100,000 if you hire a room full of editors. But the web was not growing at the pace of a room full of editors. In 1994, there were roughly 10,000 websites in existence. By 1996, there were hundreds of thousands. By 1998, there were millions. The tree Yang and Filo had planted was beautiful, and it was doomed. And the second half of this story is the slow, expensive discovery of exactly how doomed. But that reckoning was years away, and in the winter of 1994, the only problem that felt real was that a graduate project was breaking a university's network. The solution arrived in the person of a man named Michael Moritz, a partner at a venture capital firm on Sand Hill Road, the 2-mile stretch of low office parks above Stanford that would, over the next 30 years, fund more of the modern world than any square mile of real estate on Earth. Moritz had been a journalist before he was an investor, and he had a reporter's instinct for a story that was bigger than the people telling it. He came down to the trailer. Accounts of that first meeting describe exactly what you would expect. 2 exhausted students, a workstation running hot, pizza boxes, and a wall of servers held together by improvisation. Moritz's firm had recently backed another young company, and he was not a man who invested casually, but he looked at the traffic numbers, and the numbers were the kind that make a careful man's mouth go dry. In April of 1995, that firm put roughly $2 million into Yahoo. Yang and Filo took leaves of absence from their doctoral programs, leaves that, like so many leaves of absence in the history of Silicon Valley, would never end. Neither man ever finished his PhD. They moved out of the trailer and into real office space in Mountain View, and they began, for the first time, to think of the thing they had built not as a guide, but as a business. And here the story bends in a way that matters, because the decision they made next would define everything that came after. They decided that Yahoo was not a technology company. They decided it was a media company. Read that sentence twice, because it is the hinge the entire rise and fall turns on. In 1995, this was not a foolish idea. It was arguably the smart idea, the sophisticated idea, the idea the grown-ups in the room applauded. A search index was a utility, and utilities were dull and hard to monetize. But a destination, a place people came to and stayed, a place with content and channels and personality. That was a magazine. That was a television network. And everyone in America already knew how to make money from magazines and television networks. You sold advertising against attention. Yahoo had attention, oceans of it. So Yahoo would become a place, not a tool. It would add news and stock quotes and weather and horoscopes and sports scores and eventually email and chat and shopping and games. It would become what the industry would soon call a portal. The front door to the internet, the page you set as your homepage and never really left. To understand why this looked like genius, you have to remember what the web felt like to an ordinary person in 1995. Most Americans reaching the internet did so through a screeching modem and a service like AOL, and the open web beyond the walled garden was a bewildering, half-lit place with no map. Yahoo was the map. You typed the address, and there it was. A clean blue and white page, that unmistakable exclamation point logo, and a directory that told you the internet had an order to it, a place for everything. It was reassuring. It was human. It felt curated because it was curated. For millions of first-time users, Yahoo was not a website. Yahoo was the internet. By early 1996, the company was ready to go public, and here the numbers begin to tell the story better than any narration can. On April 12, 1996, Yahoo listed on the Nasdaq. The stock had been priced at $13 a share. When trading opened, it did not walk. It detonated. Within the first hours, it more than doubled, touching $43 before settling around $33 by the close. In a single day of trading, a 2-year-old company built by 2 graduate students who had never finished their degrees was valued at roughly $850 million. Yang and Filo, on paper, were suddenly worth well over $100 million apiece. They were both under 30, and the astonishing part is that this was the modest beginning. The IPO was a firecracker. The bonfire was still ahead. Over the next 4 years, as the dot-com mania inflated, Yahoo's valuation would climb into ranges that, viewed from any sane distance, made no sense whatsoever, and made perfect sense to everyone living inside the bubble. The company hired a chief executive from outside, a seasoned Hollywood and motion picture industry executive named Tim Kugel, a soft-spoken engineer-turned-manager who had run a hardware company and who brought a steady adult hand to the operation. Kugel believed in the media vision. He would spend years executing it with real discipline, and for a while it worked so spectacularly that questioning it would have seemed like madness. But underneath the portal, underneath the horoscopes and the stock tickers and the surface area growing wider by the month, there was still that original engine straining in the dark, the problem of how a person finds a specific thing among an exploding universe of things. Yahoo had solved it for 10,000 sites with a human hierarchy. It had not solved it. It had barely begun to think seriously about solving it. For 10 million, and so, quietly, sensibly, in a way that looked at the time like a purchasing decision and not a fork in the history of technology, Yahoo made a choice about its search box. It decided that search was a feature, not the point. When users typed a query that the human directory could not answer, Yahoo would simply hand them off to a search engine, a piece of underlying technology licensed from someone else, running behind the scenes, unbranded, invisible, a plumbing supplier to Yahoo's shining front door. For the first years, that plumbing came from a company called OpenText, and later from a firm called Inktomi, spun out of Berkeley. Search was a commodity. You rented it. You did not build your life around it. Why would you? Search did not keep people on your page. It sent them away, off to some other website, which was precisely the opposite of what a media company wanted. A media company wanted stickiness. A media company wanted eyeballs to linger. The very idea that the best possible search engine, one so good it fired you off the page as fast as possible and delighted you for it, could be worth more than the entire glittering portal was, in 1997, not a controversial idea. It was not even an idea anyone bothered to have, which is roughly the moment 2 other Stanford graduate students, working out of another university project a few hundred yards from where Yang and Filo had strung their servers, were about to become the most important thing that ever happened to Yahoo, and the thing Yahoo would look straight at, twice, and wave away. Their names were Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and in 1997, they were not entrepreneurs. They were doctoral students in the computer science department at Stanford, working on a research project with the unglamorous working title Backrub, named, awkwardly, for its habit of analyzing the backlinks pointing to a web page. The insight underneath it was elegant enough to be almost philosophical. Every search engine of the era, including the ones Yahoo rented, ranked a page by counting how many times your search word appeared on it. Type university, and you got whichever page had stuffed the word university into its text the most times, which meant the results were trivially easy to game and frequently useless. Page had a different idea, one borrowed loosely from the world of academic citation. A page's importance should be measured not by what it said about itself, but by how many other pages pointed to it, and how important those pages were in turn. A link was a vote. A link from an important page was a louder vote. You could model the whole web as a vast web of endorsements pointing at each other, and rank everything by a recursive score of trust. They called the algorithm PageRank, a pun on Larry's surname, and it produced results that felt, to anyone who tried it, uncanny. You typed a word, and the right answer was simply there, at the top, first. The machine that ran it was held together with the frugality of graduate students. They built their storage out of cheap consumer hard drives bought on a budget and lashed together, housed at one point in a casing wrapped in the kind of colorful toy building bricks children play with, because a proper enclosure cost money they did not have. The whole apparatus lived in a Stanford dorm room, and later in a rented garage in Menlo Park that belonged to a woman who would herself go on to run one of the largest divisions in the company. The prototype crawled the web slowly, consumed nearly half of Stanford's entire network bandwidth at one point, and threatened repeatedly to crash the university's connection. It was, in the most literal sense, a research nuisance, and it was also, quietly, the best search engine that had ever existed. Here is where the story reaches the first of its two great missed forks, and here is where an honest history has to slow down and hold more than one fact at once, because the tidy version, the version told at cocktail parties and in cautionary business school lectures, is that Yahoo, drunk on portal money, was offered Google for a pittance, and out of pure arrogance, said no. That version is satisfying. It is also incomplete. What actually happened in those early days is that Page and Brin, worn down by the cost and disruption of running a search engine out of a university, genuinely tried to sell the technology and get back to their studies. The figure that has come down through the years is that they were willing to license or sell the core of it for something on the order of $1 million, and by some accounts far less. They shopped it. They talked to the portals of the day, the very companies that were renting their search plumbing from Inktomi and OpenText, and the portals, Yahoo among them, were not interested. You can read this two ways, and honest history holds both. Read the first way. It is a failure of imagination so total, it becomes almost tragic. Here was a technology that solved the exact problem Yahoo had decided was a mere feature, offered for less than the company spent on a marketing campaign, and the people running Yahoo could not see it because they had already decided what business they were in. They were a media company. Media companies do not buy plumbing. Search sent users away. The portal wanted them to stay. A better search engine, by the logic of the portal, was a worse business. It emptied your rooms faster. Turning down PageRank was not stupidity. It was the perfectly rational conclusion of a strategy everyone in the building believed in, but read it the second way, and it looks very different. In 1998, Google did not make $1. It had no advertising model, no revenue, no proven way to turn those beautiful results into money. Nobody, not Page, not Brin, not the venture capitalists who eventually funded them, yet knew that search would become the single most profitable advertising surface ever invented. The thing that would later make Google worth $1 trillion was not the ranking algorithm at all. It was a way of selling small text advertisements against search queries sold by auction, and that machine did not yet exist and would not for years. A Yahoo executive in 1998 looking at Backrub was not looking at a money printer. He was looking at a bandwidth-hogging research toy that helped users leave your website faster, offered by two students who mostly wanted to go back to their dissertations. Passing on it was, by the information available at the time, defensible. Both of those things are true. The men who said no were not fools, and they were also catastrophically wrong, and the difference between those two statements is the entire discipline of judging history fairly. What none of them could see was that the ground itself was about to shift, because Page and Brin, having failed to sell the thing, did the only thing left to do. They took a leave of absence from Stanford, incorporated a company in September of 1998, cashed a now legendary check for $100,000 written to an entity that did not yet legally exist, and set out to build the business themselves. They renamed the search engine after a mathematician's word for the number 1 followed by 100 zeros. Google, misspelled on the way to the trademark office into Google. And the little search box that Yahoo had decided was plumbing began, week by week, to grow into something that would make the entire glittering portal look, in hindsight, like a beautifully decorated waiting room in front of a door nobody was using. But the second fork, the one that is even harder to explain, the one that came years later when Google was no longer a toy, but a genuine phenomenon with revenue and momentum, and a name everyone knew. That fork was still ahead, and to understand how Yahoo walked up to it a second time, you have to understand first just how enormous, how untouchable, how completely dominant Yahoo itself became in the 2 years in between. Because in the window between the two great refusals, Yahoo did not shrink, it exploded. If you want to understand why the second no was possible, why a company would look at Google twice and blink twice, you have to feel how invincible Yahoo felt from the inside during those years. And the only honest way to convey that is in numbers, because the numbers from that era read like typos. On April 12, 1996, Yahoo went public. The offering priced at $13 a share. By the close of that first trading day, the stock had touched 43, a gain of 270%, and a company that had been 2 graduate students and a list of favorite websites 18 months earlier was suddenly valued at just under $1 billion. That was already extraordinary. It was also nothing compared to what came next. Because the thing that happened to Yahoo between 1996 and the very beginning of 2000 was not growth in any ordinary business sense. It was the dot-com bubble finding its perfect mascot and pouring itself into a single ticker symbol. By the last days of 1999 and the first days of 2000, Yahoo's stock had climbed past $450 a share. Its market capitalization crested somewhere north of $125 billion, a figure that at that moment made a company with a few $100 million of actual revenue worth more than Boeing, more than most of the industrial giants that had taken a century to build. On paper, the 2 founders were each worth billions. The building in Santa Clara filled with the particular energy of a place where everyone has just become rich on stock they cannot yet sell but can already feel, and the purple was everywhere. Purple carpet, purple cubicle walls, a giant purple yodeling logo, a company culture that had decided its own quirkiness was a competitive moat. And here is the thing you must hold on to, because it is the key to the whole second refusal. Yahoo was not deluded to feel dominant. It really was dominant. In those years, it was, by most measures, the single most visited destination on the entire World Wide Web. Tens of millions of people did not go to the internet. They went to Yahoo and let Yahoo be the internet for them. Yahoo Mail, Yahoo Finance, which day traders refreshed obsessively as the market climbed, Yahoo Sports, Yahoo Messenger, blinking and dinging on desktops across the country, My Yahoo, the personalized page where a user could stack their stocks and their horoscope and their local weather into one purple column. GeoCities, the sprawling city of amateur homepages, which Yahoo bought in 1999 for roughly $3.5 billion in stock. Broadcast.com, an early streaming outfit, acquired the same year for nearly $6 billion in stock. A deal that made its co-founder, a brash Texan named Mark Cuban, a billionaire, and gave him the money he would famously use to buy a basketball team. Read those acquisitions one way, and they look like the confident empire building of a company that understood the future and was assembling it piece by piece. GeoCities gave Yahoo the users. Broadcast.com gave it the coming world of streaming media. Each purchase widened the portal, deepened the moat, added another reason never to leave. That was the internal logic, and in the moment it was persuasive. Yahoo was not buying a search algorithm because Yahoo had already decided correctly for its own model that the future was not a search box you left through. The future was a destination you stayed inside. Every metric the company tracked, page views, time on site, registered accounts, ad impressions, rewarded stickiness. And by that scoreboard, Yahoo was winning so decisively that questioning the scoreboard felt like heresy. Read it the other way, though, and something colder comes into focus. Almost all of that value was paid in Yahoo's own wildly inflated stock. GeoCities and Broadcast.com were not bought with cash Yahoo had earned. They were bought with a currency whose price bore no relationship to any business fundamental, and both would later be written down toward nothing. Broadcast.com essentially shuttered. GeoCities eventually shut off entirely. A whole civilization of homemade web pages switched to black. The company was using a balloon to buy other balloons and calling the sum an empire. And the deeper problem was structural, not financial. Yahoo did not really know what it was. Was it a media company selling ads? A technology company? A shopping mall? It called itself, grandly, a media network. And it hired executives from Hollywood and television to run it that way. Men who understood audiences and advertising rates and premium content, and who looked at engineering the way a landlord looks at plumbing. Necessary, unglamorous, best outsourced. That last instinct is the thread that runs straight from the first refusal to the second. When Yahoo decided in 1998 that search was plumbing, it was not a random error. It was the company being consistent with its own theory of itself. A media network does not need to own the pipe, it needs to own the audience and sell the ads. So Yahoo did exactly what its theory recommended. It let someone else provide the search technology and concentrated on being the destination. For a while, it licensed results from a company called Inktomi, and then, in the year 2000, it went looking for a better back-end search provider to power the little box on its own homepage. The box it had decided was beneath its real ambitions, and it signed a deal with a small, fast-growing startup whose results were now unmistakably the best on the web. That startup was Google. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it is one of the most quietly astonishing arrangements in the history of American business. In the year 2000, Yahoo, the most visited site on Earth, worth over $100 billion, hired Google to run the searches inside Yahoo. The tiny company Yahoo had declined to acquire was now working for Yahoo as a supplier, its clean blue links appearing on the world's biggest portal with a modest little "powered by Google" credit line at the bottom of the results. Millions of people encountered the Google name for the first time not on Google's own site, but as a footnote on Yahoo's. Yahoo was, in effect, paying to introduce its future executioner to the largest audience on the internet and stamping its own endorsement underneath. To the executives in Santa Clara, this was not a humiliation. It was smart sourcing. Let the search nerds handle search. Keep the audience. Keep the ad dollars. Keep the purple. And by the metrics they trusted, it worked. Yahoo's search worked better than ever. Users were happy, and the portal hummed along. But something was happening in the daylight that the dashboards were not built to measure. Every time an American typed a query into Yahoo and saw those words at the bottom, "powered by Google," a new brand was being carved, syllable by syllable, into the national vocabulary. People began to say the word. They began to type Google directly into their browsers, skipping the middleman entirely, because they had learned where the good answers actually came from. And down in Mountain View, in a low building that had once housed part of another company entirely, Page and Brin's engineers were quietly building the thing that Yahoo's whole worldview had assumed did not exist, a way to make search itself, that supposedly unprofitable plumbing, into the most lucrative machine in the history of advertising. It was called AdWords, and its second transformative version arrived in 2002. The idea was almost insultingly simple in hindsight, and it was the exact inversion of everything Yahoo believed. Yahoo sold display banners, big, expensive brand name splashes bought by big, expensive brand name companies, sold by a sales force, priced by negotiation. Google sold something else entirely. It sold small text ads, auctioned automatically, keyed to the exact words a person had just typed, and it charged nothing until someone actually clicked. A florist in Ohio could spend $9. A dentist could bid on the word toothache at 2 in the morning with no salesman on the phone. The ads were relevant because they were tied to intent. A person searching for running shoes was, at that precise instant, more valuable to a shoe company than any magazine reader in history. Google had found the thing Yahoo swore did not exist. It had turned the plumbing into a gold mine. And here is the quiet, devastating detail that engineers love and executives hate. The very quality of Google's search results, the thing Yahoo had licensed, the thing Yahoo had stamped its endorsement beneath, was what made the ads worth so much. Good results brought people back. People coming back generated more searches. More searches meant more auctions, more clicks, more data to refine the next ranking. The loop that Yahoo had dismissed as a cost center was, in fact, a compounding engine, and every turn of it made Google both more useful and more profitable at the same time. Yahoo had been renting the front half of that engine and had failed to notice that the back half printed money. By 2002, the people in Santa Clara had noticed, and this is where the story returns, for the last time, to the number that hangs over the whole thing. Yahoo, now under new leadership and belatedly convinced that owning search mattered after all, went back to Mountain View and tried, seriously, to buy Google. The reported figure was around $3 billion. Page and Brin, depending on which account you believe, countered it closer to 5. And you can read what happened next 2 ways, and honest history holds both. Read it one way, and Yahoo simply lowballed a company that knew exactly what it was worth. Google's founders had watched their own product become a verb on Yahoo's homepage. They had seen the AdWords revenue curve. They were not going to sell the future for a discount, and Yahoo, still anchored to the price it had passed on for a fraction of that just 3 years earlier, could not stomach the multiple. The talks collapsed over the gap between $3 billion and $5 billion. Read it the other way, and there was never really a deal to be had. By 2002, Page and Brin had no intention of selling at any price a portal company could rationalize. The negotiation was less a purchase than a confirmation, for both sides, of a truth that had already hardened. Yahoo did not walk away from Google twice because it was stupid. It walked away because its entire theory of the internet told it, correctly by its own logic and catastrophically by history's, that the destination mattered and the plumbing did not. Google went public on August 19, 2004, at $85 a share, valuing the company. Yahoo had twice declined at roughly $23 billion. It would cross $100 billion within years, then $1 trillion. Yahoo, for its part, spent the next decade as one of the most valuable cautionary tales in the industry, a company that owned the audience and lost the future, that tried to be a media empire and a technology company at once, and was outbuilt at both. It bought broadcast.com for over $5 billion and shuttered it. It passed on buying Facebook. It fielded and turned down a $44 billion offer from Microsoft in 2008, a number that in later years read like a fantasy. And in 2017, the company that had once been the front door to the entire internet, the Purple Portal, worth over $125 billion at its peak, sold its core operating business to Verizon for about $4.5 billion, less than the price it had once put on Google. Less than a rounding error against the trillions its licensed footnote would come to be worth. So, what survived? Not the portal, not really. Verizon folded Yahoo and AOL together into a unit it called Oath, a name that itself did not survive, and the assets have since changed hands again. But go looking, and the artifacts are still there. The Stanford server rack that first ran the crawler, the one built from a cabinet, 10 hard drives, and a housing famously made of Lego bricks so the platters could breathe, sits behind glass now, part of the record of how this all began. The word Google is in the dictionary as a verb, lowercase, exactly the fate its founders once feared and the market came to love. And the deeper legacy is the idea itself, the notion that the plumbing was the prize, that the person typing a question was worth more than the person reading a banner, that measuring what people actually did beat guessing what they might want. Yahoo held that idea in its hands twice, endorsed it in a footnote, licensed it, and handed it back, one negotiation at a time. There is no villain in this story, and that is what makes it worth telling. The people at Yahoo were not fools. They were smart operators executing a coherent strategy that had made them, briefly, the most visited destination on Earth. They simply bet, twice, that the future belonged to the front door rather than to the thing behind it, and they were wrong in the most expensive way a company can be wrong. Not by failing to see Google, but by seeing it clearly, paying to introduce it to the world, and deciding it wasn't worth owning. So we want to hear from you. When did you first learn the word Google? Was it typed directly into your browser, or did you first see it as that little gray footnote at the bottom of a Yahoo results page? And do you still have an old Yahoo email address, a GeoCities relic, a purple homepage set as your default long after the world had moved on? Tell us the year you made the switch, and whether you remember the exact moment the plumbing became the whole house. The people who lived through this shift know more than any earnings report, and this archive is still being built.